Chapter 4 of The Calico Cat. When Nancy Ware, Jim's pretty teacher, heard that Mr. Edwards had let Jim go to jail, she was hotly indignant. She liked Jim and laughed a little over him, for she knew he adored her. In her view, he was a clumsy, nice boy, awkward and shy, to be sure, but rewarding her friendliness now and then with a really entrancing grin. She liked his imagination, she liked his loyalty, and she liked his dogged resolution. She heard the news at the noon hour on Monday, and after her dinner she hurried at once to the store of Fred Farnsworth. To him she roundly declared that Mr. Edwards was a brute, a view of the man which struck Fred as a bit highly colored. Fred was 31 or 32 years old, a sensible, humorous fellow, with considerable personal force. He was very proud of the handsome shop over which hung the sign, Frederick W. Farnsworth, Fine Crockery and Glassware, and still prouder of his engagement to Miss Ware. He was the second grand juryman from Elmington. "Oh," said he, "Edwards isn't a bad sort of man. He isn't very sociable. I guess he wouldn't take much impudence, even from that boy of his. They say Jim wouldn't own up, and the old man won't do anything for him till he does." "If Jimmy Edwards says he didn't fire that gun, he didn't," said Nancy, positively. "Jimmy isn't the lying kind. I know Mr. Edwards. I ought not to call him a brute, I suppose, but he's one of those obstinate men who will do anything they've made up their minds to do, even if you prove to them that they're wrong, even if it hurts them more than it does anyone else. He's just got it into his head that Jimmy ought to confess, and he'd let him go to the gallows before he'd back down." Nancy spoke with animation, her color rose and her eyes grew bright, and Fred looked and listened admiringly. He was skeptical about Jim, but he was struck with the accuracy of the portrait of Edwards. "I guess that's about so," he said. "And when I think of that poor boy shut up in that awful jail, locked into a cell, when he ought to be out of doors playing ball and having a good time, it makes my blood boil," continued Miss Ware. "Now, Fred," she concluded with pretty decision, "you must stop it." Fred laughed. "Isn't that a pretty large order?" he asked. "Squire Tucker put him there. I guess it's legal." "You can do something," said his betrothed. "Go to see Jimmy. See if you can't find out what's the matter. Jimmy likes you. Perhaps he'll tell." "I didn't know Jim had any particular partiality for me," said Fred, but he felt kindlier toward the boy in spite of himself. "If you can only find out what really happened, I know we can get him out," averred Miss Ware. "Why don't you go yourself?" said Farnsworth. "I can't. Not till 5 o'clock. Of course I'm going then." "That's about 4 hours off," said Farnsworth. "But I want something done now," exclaimed Nancy. "Oh," said Fred humorously. "Will you go?" "Of course. I'll start at once." Fred dropped his banter. "I'll tell you what, Nancy. I may not be able to do much right off, but I'll promise you that he has a fair chance before the grand jury." Farnsworth started at once for the jail. It was a poor place for a boy, he reflected, as he rang the jailer's private bell. Calkins himself was not there, and his wife came to the door. She knew Farnsworth, and when he asked if he might see Jim, she laughed a little and told him to step right in. Hotel Calkins was a brick building which looked pleasantly like a private dwelling, as in fact a good half of it was. In this front half dwelt the jailer, In the rear half, separated from the living quarters by a thick wall and heavy doors, was the jail proper. There Farnsworth expected to be led. But not at all. Mrs. Calkins ushered him into her own kitchen, where a washtub showed what she was doing, where the afternoon sun and sweet September air poured in at the open windows, and where a canary in its cage was singing cheerily. Here Farnsworth was much surprised to see Jim, curled up in Mrs. Calkins's own rocking-chair, eating a large, red-cheeked apple which he was dividing with a brand-new knife. "Squire Tucker told Mark," said Mrs. Calkins, enjoying the joke, "that he guessed James would like our society full as well as that of the prisoners." As for Jim, he grinned affably and took another slice of his apple. The awful picture which Miss Ware had drawn of Jim's dreadful isolation and misery, and her own indignant sympathy, rushed upon Farnsworth's mind, and were so comically out of relation with the facts that he sank weakly into the nearest chair and roared. "This is the way you go to jail?" he gasped. Mrs. Calkins smiled in sympathy, and Jim, half suspecting that he ought to be offended at this frank mirth, looked sheepishly at the floor. Farnsworth recovered himself. "A mighty good friend of yours," he said, "sent me over here." "Miss Ware?" asked Jim, much pleased. "Yes. She's coming herself right after school, loaded down with things to console your desolate prison life, I believe." And Farnsworth had to stop to laugh again. "But she wanted me to start right in and help you out of this, and that's what I'm here for." "Thank you," said Jim, embarrassed but polite. But it struck Farnsworth, as he said afterward, that the boy shied a little. "Miss Ware says," he went on, "that she doesn't believe you fired that shot, and she wants you to tell me exactly what did happen. Now, if we can show that you didn't shoot, I can get you out of here quick." "What are they going to do to me?" said Jim. "That depends. It makes a difference how much Lamoury's hurt. The penalty might be severe if he's got a bad wound, but even then, if we could show that you didn't know he was there, or that the gun went off by accident, or that you were firing at something else, it would make a big difference. And if you can show that you weren't there at all, why, out you go, scot-free. But, Jim, you can see yourself that if you don't tell what you know, everybody'll think that you shot and meant to hurt Lamoury, and then it might go pretty hard with you. Now come, tell me what happened." "You'd better tell, Jimmy," said Mrs. Calkins, straightening up from her washtub. "You won't find any better friends than Mr. Farnsworth and Miss Ware." The young man, as he talked, watched the boy curiously. Jim flushed and squirmed, and looked now at the floor and now out at the window, with a marked uneasiness and embarrassment that greatly puzzled his friend. And when he stopped, and the boy had to answer, his distress became really pitiable. "Can't you tell me, Jim?" Mr. Farnsworth hazarded, after a little, putting a kindly hand on the boy's arm, while Mrs. Calkins stood quiet by her tub in friendly expectation. But Jim remained dumb. After waiting a little, Farnsworth, seeing the boy so miserable, took pity on him. "Well, never mind, Jim," he said. "You needn't tell if you don't want to." He would have to let Nancy coax it out of him, but he was puzzled, impressed with a sense of mystery, and with the growing conviction that the boy was shielding someone else. He began to talk cheerfully of other things, hoping that Jim might perhaps drop a useful hint, or at least that the boy would gain confidence in him as a friend. By chance he asked, "Where did you get the knife, Jim?" "Mr. Peasley gave it to me." "Peasley!" exclaimed Farnsworth. He well knew the closeness of his fellow juror. "It isn't much of a knife," said Jim, apologetic but pleased. Jim's views of the world were changing. His father, although a bandit chief, had let him go to jail, while this stingy old man, with no halo of adventure about him, gave him a knife. And here were Miss Ware and Mr. Farnsworth and Mrs. Calkins and the jailer, none of them smugglers, who were very kind. Farnsworth rose to go. Then Jim, summoning all his courage, asked a question which had long been trembling on his lips. "What do they do to smugglers, Mr. Farnsworth?" "Fine 'em, or put 'em in jail, or both. Why?" "Nothing much," said Jim, but obviously he was cast down. Farnsworth walked thoughtfully toward his store. "By George!" he thought suddenly. "I wonder—" The gossip about the senior Edwards had occurred to him, and at the same time he remembered the quarrel with Lamoury. "But what nonsense!" he thought. "If Edwards wanted to shoot anyone, he wouldn't do it in his own backyard, and he wouldn't treat his own boy that way either." Still, the idea clung to him. And then he thought of Nancy and chuckled. "If she comes to the store before she goes to the jail, I won't tell her what she'll find there," he promised himself. Meanwhile, Mr. Peasley felt a growing discomfort. He ate his dinner and answered the brisk questions of his wife with increasing preoccupation. Like Miss Ware, he was picturing Jim solitary and suffering in his lonely cell. With the utmost sincerity and ingenuousness, he condemned Mr. Edwards. "Hain't he got any feelin' for his own flesh and blood?" he asked himself. "'Tain't right. Somebody'd ought to deal with him." As he pottered about his yard after dinner, he finally worked himself up to the point of speaking to Edwards himself. Even his righteous indignation would not have led him to this undertaking had he known Mr. Edwards better, or realized the father's present mood. Hurt exceedingly by Jim's lying and contempt of his wishes, hurt even more through his disappointed desire to help his boy, Mr. Edwards was sore and sensitive, discontented both with Jim and with himself. He did not want Jim in jail, he told himself, and the neighbors who were so uniformly assuming that he did might better give their thoughts to matters that concerned them more. He would get the boy out of jail quick enough if the boy would only let him. As he stepped out of the house to do an errand at the barn, Mr. Peasley hailed him over the dividing fence. Somewhat put out, Mr. Edwards nevertheless turned and walked toward his neighbor. Mr. Peasley, leaning over the fence, began. "Edwards," he said, reaching out an anxious, deprecatory hand, "don't you think you're just a little mite hard on that boy of yourn?" He got no further. Edwards gave him a look that made him shiver and cut the conversation short by turning on his heel and marching toward the barn. "Dreadful harsh, man, dreadful harsh," Mr. Peasley muttered to himself. "Nice, likely boy as ever was. If I had a boy like that, I swan I wouldn't treat him so consarned mean." He turned away much shocked, and saw the calico cat watching him ironically from the chicken house. "Drat that cat," said he. "I ain't going to stay round here, not with that beast grinning at me." He got his hat and started uptown, not knowing in the least what he intended to do there. He stopped, however, at every shop window and studied baseballs, bats, Tivoli boards, accordions. He was beginning to wonder if a 25-cent knife was enough to console Jim for his unmerited incarceration. He was gazing forlornly in at the window of Upham's drugstore, where some half-dozen harmonicas were displayed, and wondering if Jim would be allowed to play one in his dungeon cell, when Hibbard spoke to him. He drew the lawyer aside, and peering closely into his face with anxious eyes exaggerated by his spectacles, said insinuatingly, "Just 'twixt you and me, kinder confidential. Pete ain't hurt bad, is he? You don't mind sayin', do you?" Jake drew himself up, surprised and suspicious. Did the old fool think him as innocent as all that? "He's hurt bad, Mr. Peasley, bad," he said with dignity. "Of course it isn't fatal, unless it should mortify." He waved his hand deprecatingly. "I can't imagine what that Edwards boy used in his gun." Mr. Peasley knew, the marble. He trembled. Still, he knew Jake's reputation. A shrewd thought visited his troubled mind. "What doctor's seeing him?" he asked. "Doctor!" exclaimed Hibbard, irritated. "Doctor! You know these French Canadians. They're worse scared of a doctor than of the evil one himself. Pete's using some old woman's stuff on his wounds. Bear's grease, rattlesnake oil, catnip tea. What do I know? I can't make him see a doctor." "Some doctor'll have to testify to court, won't they?" persisted Mr. Peasley. "Oh, I'll look out for that, don't you fear," the lawyer said easily, but nevertheless he made a pretext for leaving the old man. Perhaps had Mr. Peasley's fears not been so keen, he would have taken some comfort from this conversation. But as it was, he felt that the lawyer was dangerous. He feared that Pete really was badly hurt. It would go hard, then, with Jim. It would, by the same token, go hard with himself should he confess. Suddenly he turned and rushed into Upham's store. "Upham," said he, "I want that." And he pointed straight at a big harmonica with a strange and wonderful harp attachment, bright-colored and of amazing possibilities. Upham, a neat little gentleman with nicely trimmed side whiskers, who was always fluttered by the unexpected, hesitated, half-opened his mouth, and then forgot either to shut it or to speak. "Why, Mr. Peasley," he stammered at last, "it's real expensive. It's $2.75. "Don't care nothing what it costs," said Mr. Peasley, who was in a hurry for fear lest he should think twice. When he came out of the store with the harmonica in his hands, he almost stumbled into Miss Ware. She was on her way to Jim, and of course her mind was full of his affairs. Here was Mr. Edwards' next neighbor. She impulsively stopped to ask if the misguided father still held to his resolution about Jim. Mr. Peasley had reason to know that he did, and said so. "I tell you, Miss Ware," said he with much emotion, "he belongs to a stony-hearted generation, and that's a fact. He ain't got any compassion in him, seems though." "It's a shame, a perfect shame!" exclaimed Nancy. "'Tain't right," said Mr. Peasley, with a warmth which surprised the young woman, and made her warm to this old man, whom she had always thought so selfish. "'Tain't right. Your own flesh and blood so." "Well," said Miss Ware, "I'm going to the jail now. I want to see Jimmy. It must be awful there." "Well, now, that's real kind of you," responded Mr. Peasley. I wonder now if you'd mind taking this along to him." And he offered her the paper parcel. "It's a harmonica, I guess they call it. It's real handsome. It costs considerable, a pretty considerable sum. I feel kinder sorry for the little feller, and don't grudge it a mite." And he kept repeating in a tone which suggested whistling to keep your courage up, "Not a mite, not a mite." Miss Ware smothered a laugh on hearing what the present was. She must not hurt the feelings of this kind old man. "Oh," said the little hypocrite, "that's nice. Jimmy'll be so pleased." But perhaps the harmonica pleased Jim as much as the school books which the school-teacher, with a solicitous eye on her pupil standing in his studies, was taking to him. Saying good-bye to Mr. Peasley, Miss Ware, books and harmonica in hand, went on her way to visit the afflicted boy in his dungeon. Meanwhile Jim, turning the ringer for Mrs. Calkins, and listening to her stories of Mark's prowess with all sorts of malefactors, was having an excellent time. He had decided to be a sheriff when he grew up. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Calico Cat. The day of the assembling of the grand jury for the September term of the Adams County Court finally dawned. How Mr. Peasley had looked forward to that day! How often had he pictured the scene, the bustle about the courthouse, the agreeable crowd of black-coated lawyers, with their clever talk, their good stories, the grave judge, and the still graver side judges, the greetings and handshakings amid much joking and laughter, the county gossip among the grand jurors in the informal moments before they filed into the courtroom to be sworn and to receive the judge's charge. Himself, finally, in his best black coat and cherished beaver hat, there in the midst of it, important, weighty, respected, a public man. He had cherished the vision of himself walking up the village street on that first morning, a dignitary returning the cordial and admiring salutes of his village friends. He had seen himself later in the jury room, shrewdly leading the reluctant witness, delivering weighty opinions on the bearing of testimony, and making all respect him as a marvel of conservatism, dignity, and wisdom. This was to be one of the most important and pleasurable days of his life, the rung in a ladder of preferment which reached as high as the State House dome. And when that day came, it rained, steadily, gloomily, fiercely rained. Solomon was not allowed to wear his best clothes. When, peering out of the window, he hopefully said he "guessed maybe 'twas going to clear," his wife invited him tartly to "wait till it did." She insisted that he put on his everyday clothes, and thus arrayed, and without meeting a single villager to realize the importance of his errand, he waded up to the courthouse, the pelting rain rattling on his old umbrella, the fierce wind almost wrenching it inside out. There was, of course, no parade on the courthouse steps for the benefit of a wondering village, as there would probably have been had the day been fine. Instead, the men, steaming with wet, stood about uncomfortably in the corridors, muddy with the mud from their feet, wet with the drip from their umbrellas. The air in the courthouse was close, and everyone felt uncomfortable and depressed. Mr. Peasley, having greeted 3 or 4 men whom he knew, found himself jammed into a corner behind 4 or 5 jurors who were strangers to him, but he was too disheartened to try to scrape acquaintance with them. He felt lonely and helpless. He looked enviously over to the other end of the corridor, where Fred Farnsworth, Eben Sampson, and Albion Small were standing together. In contrast with the others, these men were laughing. Albion was considerable of a joker, Mr. Peasley reflected gloomily. Then old Abijah Keith stormed in, and in his high, shrill voice began immediately to utter his unfavorable opinion of everything and everybody.
"Well, if he ain't here again!"
exclaimed in disgust Hiram Hopkins, one of the men in front of Solomon.
"Cantankerous old lummox in the whole state. Just lots on upsetting things. Abijah!" he snorted. "Can't Abijah, I call him."
Mr. Peasley shrank back into his corner nervously. He knew this old tyrant and dreaded him. Not much was done that first day. The clerk swore them, the judge charged them, and appointed the sensible, steady Sampson foreman. Then they retired to the jury room, a big, desolate place, wherein was a long, ink-spattered table surrounded by wooden armchairs and spittoons. The grand jurors seated themselves and were solemnly silent while John Page, the state's attorney, began the dull task of presenting cases. Mr. Peasley found that he had nothing brilliant to say. As a matter of fact, his own troubles were making him see everything yellow. The jurymen did not seem to him as agreeable a lot as he had expected, and as for Page, he irritated Solomon beyond measure. Page was an able young man and a good lawyer, and was entitled to the position which he had attained so young. But, the son of a man of rather exceptional means, he had been educated at a city college, and had a sophistication which Solomon viewed with deep suspicion. Moreover, he discarded the garb which Mr. Peasley regarded as sacred. He was not in black. Instead, he wore a light gray business suit. His collar was very knowing and cut, and his cravat of dark blue was caught with a gold pin.
"City-fied smart aleck,"
was Mr. Peasley's characterization. To tell the truth, he mistrusted the man's ability, and was afraid of him. If that fellow knew, Mr. Peasley felt it would go hard with him. Generally, Page was popular. Solomon had, of course, been painfully awake to every hint and intimation in regard to Jim's case. He had seen Jake Hibbard, that carrion crow of the law, loafing about the corridors, and the sight had made him shiver. He had next heard that Jim's case would be quickly called, probably on the next day, news producing a complex emotion, the elements of which he could not distinguish. Furthermore, a remark or so which he overheard indicated that the out-of-town men were inclined to take a harsh view of the matter. And reflecting on all these things, he paddled home through the depressing wet. And the next day it rained. More and more perturbed as the climax approached, Mr. Peasley took his place in the jury room, and sat there with unhearing ears. He sat and thought, and delivered battle with his conscience, which was growing painfully vigorous and aggressive. But, after all, perhaps they would not find a true bill, and then Jim would go free, and he could breathe again. Mr. Peasley clung to the hope, and hugged it. It was the one thing which gave him courage. "Gentlemen of the grand jury," suddenly he heard Page saying, "the next case for you to consider is that of James Edwards, age 15, of Elmington, charged with assault, with intent to kill, upon one Peter Lamoury, also of Elmington." And he proceeded to read the complaint, which, in spite of the monotonous rapidity with which he rattled it off, scared Mr. Peasley badly with its solemn-sounding legal phraseology. "Gentlemen," said Page, laying down the paper, "there was no eyewitness to the actual assault, and only 3 people have any personal knowledge of the event. Mr. Edwards, the defendant's father, the accused himself, and the complainant. Mr. Lamoury, his counsel tells me, is in no condition to appear. But I have here," lifting a paper, "his affidavit, properly executed, giving his version of the matter. The boy's father, however, is at hand. Probably the jury would like to question him." "It seems to me," said Mr. Sampson, "that Mr. Edwards would be pretty apt to know the rights of it, if he's willing to talk. I guess we'd better hear him." The state's attorney stepped to the door. "This way, please," he called, and Mr. Edwards entered the room. Farnsworth and Peasley both studied the man's face closely, although for very different reasons, and both found it sternly uncompromising. "Please take a chair, Mr. Edwards," said Page, and in a swift glance rapidly estimated the man. "Here's someone who won't lie," he thought, impressed. "Now," he resumed, "will you kindly tell the members of the grand jury what you know of the case?" Mr. Edwards cleared his throat painfully. Determined as he was to let his rebellious boy take whatever punishment his mistaken course might bring, he now began to wish that the punishment would be light. His confidence that Jim needed only to be pushed a little to confess was somewhat shaken, and the charge was really serious. He felt a desire to explain, to palliate, to minimize. "Gentlemen," he said, "my boy's always been a good boy. I can't believe that he meant to hurt Lamoury or anyone else. It must have been some accident." "Facts, please," said Page crisply. Mr. Peasley caught his breath indignantly. He had been entirely in sympathy with Mr. Edwards' soft mode of approaching a story. Page seemed to him unfeeling. "I will answer any questions," said Mr. Edwards, stiffening. "Did you hear any shot fired?" began Page. "Yes." "Where were you?" "I was asleep in the room above Jim's." "Was Jim in his room?" "I suppose so." "You suppose so. Don't you know?" "No, I don't know." "But to the best of your knowledge and belief he was there?" "Yes." "And the shot waked you?" "Yes." "What did you do on hearing the shot?" "I jumped to the window." "Tell what you saw, please." "I saw a man fall in the orchard, and hurried out to see if he was hurt, but he was gone when I got there." "Then what?" "I went to speak to Jim." "He was in his room, then, immediately after the shot?" "Yes." "Ah, and when you spoke to him, did he admit firing the shot?" "No." "Did he deny it?" "Yes." "Where was his gun?" "In the rack over the mantel." "In the rack over the mantel," repeated Page slowly, glancing at the jurors. "Did you examine it?" "Yes." "What was its condition? Did it show that it had been fired?" "No, it was clean." "It was clean," repeated Page. "I understand that it was a double-barreled, muzzle-loading shotgun. Were there any rags about?" "Yes." "Where were they?" "One was in the ashes of the fireplace." "Look as if someone had tried to hide it?" "Yes," reluctantly. "If it was that sort of gun, there must have been a shot pouch and powder flask. Where were they?" "In the drawer where Jim keeps them." "Everything looked then as if no shot had been fired?" "Yes." "Was there anyone besides yourself and your son in the house?" "No." "Your housekeeper?" "She had stepped out." To the best of your knowledge, then, there was no one about to fire the shot except your son?
No.
That will do, said Page with an accent of finality. That is, he added with the air of one who observes a courteous form, unless some of the grand jurors wish to ask a question. There were various things which were new to Mr. Peasley in this testimony. He had supposed that Jim had been picked as the guilty person by a process of mere exclusion. He had had no idea that the case against him was so strong. How had the boy got to the room so soon after he himself had left? And why had he gone there? And why had he cleaned the shotgun? The grand jury must believe in his guilt. And when the case came to trial, what could Jim say to clear himself? It was going hard with the boy. Mr. Peasley's mouth grew dry, his palms moist. He moved uneasily in his chair. Once or twice he felt sure that the next instant he would find himself on his feet, but the minutes passed, and he still was seated. And Farnsworth, anxious, for the sake of his betrothed Miss Ware, to help Jim, was nonplussed. There were two possible explanations of Jim's cleaning the gun, if he did clean it. The first, that Jim was protecting himself. The second, that he was shielding someone else. But the second theory seemed quite untenable. Farnsworth had made some cautious but well-directed inquiries about Mr. Edwards, and had satisfied himself that the rumors about his smuggling were nothing but malicious gossip. There was not a man of greater honesty in the state. The boy must have done the shooting. Miss Ware would have to give it up. Still, he would hazard a question.
"Mr. Edwards," he said, "Lamry worked for you once, didn't he?"
"Yes."
"You quarreled, didn't you?"
"I discharged him for intemperance."
"There was no bad blood?"
"Lamry was angry, I believe." Farnsworth stopped. There was nothing to be gained by this course of questioning in the way of clearing Jim. Of course, later, the point that Lamry had a grudge against the family might have importance, although he could not see just how. Someone else surely heard that gunshot. It was incredible that the neighborhood should be so deserted. If only there were another witness. The other jurors had no questions. They were, to tell the truth, a little impatient. It was near the dinner hour, and they were hungry. The case seemed perfectly plain to them. It was not likely, they argued, that the boy's father could be mistaken. "You may go," said Page to Mr. Edwards. "I don't see," he began when the witness had left the room, "any need for our going further into this case. Whatever we may think of the animus of the complainant, I take it that that was what you wished to bring out, Mr. Farnsworth. There seems to be no question but that the boy fired the shot. The presumption seems strong also that he intended to hit. Were there any accident or any good excuse, the boy could, of course, have no motive not to tell it. I suggest that a true bill be found at once, and that we proceed to more important matters. I want to remind you that we have a great deal of work before us."
"Well, gentlemen," said Sampson, "I guess we're pretty much of a mind about this. If no one has any objections, I guess we'll call it a vote."
He looked round.
"As we're all agreed," he began.
"Just a moment, Sampson!" suddenly exclaimed Farnsworth. It had just then flashed over him that Mr. Peasley, the kind Mr. Peasley, who gave Jim knives and harmonicas, was next-door neighbor to the Edwardses. If he had been at home when the shot was fired, he must have heard it, and he might have seen some significant thing which questioning might bring out. Of course, if Peasley had seen anything, he would have spoken, but he might have overlooked the importance of some fact or other. "Just a moment, Sampson," he said, and put up his hand. Then he swung sharply in his chair and put the question, "Peasley, where were you when that shot was fired?" End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Calico Cat. "Peasley, where were you when that shot was fired?" asked Farnsworth, and as he spoke he turned and looked toward Solomon, whose seat was some 3 or 4 places to his left on the same side of the table. Had the question not been uttered, it would have died upon his lips, so much surprised was he at what he saw. Mr. Peasley, white and trembling with some strong emotion, had his hands upon the table and was raising himself, slowly and painfully, to his feet. He rolled his eyes, which looked bigger and more pathetic than ever behind his glasses, toward Farnsworth at the sound of his voice, but the young man knew instinctively that Solomon, moved by some strong idea of his own, had not grasped the question.
"Gentlemen,"
Mr. Peasley began in shaky tones,
"I guess I got a word to say afore you find a true bill agin that little feller. He's as peaceable a boy as ever I saw, and I guess I can't let him stay all bolted and barred into no jail when it don't need anything but my say-so to get him out. You see, gentlemen,"
Solomon paused, moistened his dry mouth, and cast a timorous look over the puzzled faces of the jurymen,
"you see, it 'twas me that shot Lamoury."
Not a sound came from the grand jury. The members sat and stared at him in blank wonder, hardly able to credit their ears. Page, the state's attorney, who was making some notes at the time, held his pen for a good half-minute part way between his paper and the inkstand while he gazed in astonishment at Peasley. To have a grand juror, a sober, respectable man, rise in the jury room and confess that he is the real offender in a case under consideration is not usual. The surprise was absolute. For Farnsworth it was more than a surprise. It was a relief. Then his betrothed had been right. Jim had not fired the shot. He felt a glow of admiration for Nancy's sure intuition and loyalty to her pupil. He rejoiced that Jim was cleared for her sake and for the boys. Insensibly he had grown more and more interested in Jim and attached to him. Now everything was explained. Everything? No. Jim's strange activity in concealing the evidences of the shot, his queer reserve when questioned as to what he knew, these seemed more perplexing than ever. Farnsworth, hoping for light upon these points, settled back in his chair to listen. Mr. Peasley had more to say.
"It kinder goes agin the grain,"
Solomon resumed with a weary, deprecatory smile.
"To own up you've been acting like a fool, but I guess I got to do it. This was the way on it. I stepped over to Eddard's just to talk over matters and things. Well, I couldn't seem to raise anybody to the front of the house, so I kinder slid into the boys' room to see if there wasn't somebody out back. There wasn't. There didn't seem to be anybody to home. Now, gentlemen, seems as though you'd see how 'twas when I tell you. There's an old white and yaller cat, with a kinder sassy patch over her eye." Mr. Peasley's meek voice here took on a trace of heat. "That's been a pesterin' the life out of me goin' on a year. I guess you know how 'tis. One of them pesky, yowlin', chicken-stealin', rusty old nuisances that hain't any sociability to 'em anyhow. Well, there she was a-settin', comfortable as a hot punkin pie, and lookin' as if she owned the place. And there was the boy's gun right there handy. The cat riled me so, I just loaded her up. 'Twa'n't in human nature not to, now was it? 'Twa'n't nothin' but bird shot, so I sorter stuck in a marble. I couldn't do no harm, and it might kinder help a leetle, and I just fired her off. I didn't expect to hit any French Canadian. I didn't know there was any of the critters round. Then when I see a feller fall out of the bushes, I was scared, now I tell you. Here I was, member of the grand jury and everything, and it didn't somehow seem right and fittin' for no member of the grand jury to be fillin' up a feller human being with bird shot and marbles. I guess I didn't think much what I was a-doin' of, nohow. 'Tany rate, I just sneaked off home, and then I just let things slip along and slide along till here I be. I guess if a true bill's got to be found agin anyone, it's got to be found agin me." And Mr. Peasley sank huddled and hopeless into his chair. His fellow members were for a moment silent, but soon this tale of a cat, bird shot, and an unexpected Canadian began to disclose a comic aspect. The plight of poor, respectable Mr. Peasley, in all the fresh honors of his jurorship, began to show a ludicrous side. Their own position as grave men seeing what they thought a serious offense change as by magic into a farcical accident, bit by bit revealed its humor. Sampson, the foreman, glanced at Page, the state's attorney. The young man's face wore an odd expression. Their eyes met, and Sampson's mouth began to twitch. Albion Small, who was considerable of a joker, suddenly choked. Farnsworth, having revealed to him in a flash the significance of the harmonica with harp attachment, gave way and laughed outright. Smiles appeared on faces all round the table, and as the comicality of the whole affair more and more struck upon their astonished minds, the smiles became a general laugh, the laugh a roar, and this mirth had so good-humored a note that Solomon, taking heart, looked about the table with a sheepish grin. But his heart sank, and his grin vanished when his eyes fell upon Abijah Keith. For Abijah did not smile. He sat grim as fate, stern disapproval of all this levity expressed in every deep fold of his wrinkled old countenance. A formidable person was Abijah. He had a great brush of white hair, which stood up fiercely from his narrow forehead, a high, arched nose like the beak of a hawk, on which rested a pair of huge round spectacles, a mouth like a straight line enclosed between a great parenthesis of leathery wrinkles. Up from under his old-fashioned stock, round a chin like a paving stone, curled an aggressive, white, wiry beard, and his blue eyes were steel-bright and hard. "Can't see what you're cackling so for," he exclaimed, his shrill accents full of contempt. "Actin' like a passel of hens. There's a man shot, ain't they? Somebody shot him, didn't they? He—" and Abijah pointed a knotted, skinny, hard old finger at the shrinking Solomon. "He shot him, didn't he? Serious business, I call it. Guess the grand jury's got something to say to it, hain't they? Cat's foot, I say. Likely story, likely story. Don't believe a word on it." Solomon dared to steal a look, and was not reassured to see in the jurymen's faces doubt replacing mirth. Then Hiram Hopkins' hearty voice
ringing with opposition, struck upon his delighted ear. He remembered Hiram's dislike for the cantankerous Keith. Here, perhaps, was a defender. "Oh, come now, Mr. Keith! Oh, come now!" he heard Hopkins exclaim. "What's the use of raising a rum puss? It wasn't nothing but bird-shot. Folks don't go murdering folks with bird-shot." "Don't care if it was bird-shot," came Abijah's snapping tones. "Don't care if it was pinheads. Principle's the same." It is, admitted Solomon in his soul. "Well," said Hiram, with a common sense in which Mr. Peasley took comfort, "the practical effect is mighty different. Gentlemen," he added to the jurors, "I can't see that we've got any call to go any further with this. Peasley was just shooting at a cat. I don't see the sense of taking up the time of the court and making expense for any such foolishness. I say we better dismiss young Edwards' case, and Peasley's along with it. It's such fool doings, I think we'd better, if only to keep folks from laughing at the grand jury." Solomon's heart was in his mouth. Would the others take this view, or Keith's? "Oily talk! Dreadful oily talk!" came Abijah's fierce pipe. "Don't take any stock in it. Shot him, didn't he? Grand juror, what difference does that make? If they ain't fit, weed 'em out. Weed 'em out." "Fit?" said Hiram. "It took some spunk to get up there and tell just what a fool he'd been, did—" "Humph!" Abijah interrupted with a snort. "Had to, didn't he? Farnsworth asked him where he was, didn't he? Had to squirm out somehow, didn't he? Got about as much spine as a taller candle with the wick drawed out, according to his own showin'. Better weed him out. Better weed him out. Humph!" Poor Mr. Peasley sank still lower in his chair. His head fell still lower on his chest. They were taking away from him even the credit of voluntary confession. Why had Farnsworth asked that question? In casting doubt upon this one brave deed, fate seemed to him to have done its worst. "He'd got up before I put the question," said Farnsworth. He wished to be just, but he was indignant with Peasley. After his first laughter, his thoughts had dwelt upon the trouble that Solomon had brought upon the innocent Jim, just to save his own hide, the old skeezicks, he exclaimed to himself. After all, what did he know about Peasley? If the man had merely shot at a cat, why under the sun should he not have said so at once, and saved all this bother? The more he thought, the more indignant he grew, and the more doubtful. He did not notice at all the look of timid gratitude which Mr. Peasley cast in his direction. "Course he was up before you spoke," Solomon was further gratified to hear Hopkins declare, in his big hearty voice. "And I think a man who owns up fair and square, just when it's hardest to, has got spine enough to hold him together anyhow." "Up before you asked him?" Abijah turned on Farnsworth. "Up for what? Tell me that, will you?" And Solomon, listening anxiously for Farnsworth's answer, was depressed to hear him give merely a good-humored laugh at Uncle Abijah's thrust. "Mr. Peasley?" asked Samson so unexpectedly that Solomon jumped. "Didn't you say something about a marble?"
"Yes," said Mr. Peasley gloomily.
"Fit the bore, did it?"
continued the foreman.
"Slick," answered Mr. Peasley with the brevity of despair.
"If that marble fitted the bore," said Albion Small, while Samson nodded assent,
It's my opinion it might do considerable damage." His opinion had weight, for Small was a hunter of repute. Recovered from their amusement, the grand jurors had become gradually impressed with the idea that Mr. Peasley's confession still left some awkward questions unanswered. If the matter were so simple as he said, why had he kept silent so long? The jurymen came from all over the rather large county, and although they all had some knowledge of the principal men of Ellington, and although such of them as had dealings at its bank had met Mr. Peasley, none of them knew him well. He was a newcomer at the village, and when at his farm had not had a wide acquaintance. They looked to Farnsworth as his fellow townsman to speak for him, but Farnsworth said nothing, and seemed preoccupied and doubtful. The inference was that he shared their perplexity. They felt that Keith, for all his cantankerousness, might be right. Solomon could draw no comfort from their faces. All this while Page had been playing with his watch chain and watching Abijah, whose character he appreciated with discreet amusement, but he found himself in essential agreement with the peppery old fellow. "Ask the state's attorney, why don't you?" put in Keith impatiently. "He'll tell you I've got the rights on it. Ain't afraid, be you?" Sampson smiled. "Mr. State's Attorney," he said, turning to Page, I guess perhaps you better give us the law of this." "Well, gentlemen," said Page, "as a matter of law, Mr. Keith would seem to be right." And at the word, Solomon's spirits sank to new depths. "Didn't I tell you?" said Abijah triumphantly. Had the state's attorney said that he was wrong, the old man would have called him a popinjay to his face. Abijah's exclamation was not deference to legal knowledge, it was merely quick seizure of a tactical point. "Lamoury was shot," Page went on, with a little smile at Keith's interruption, "and by his own statement Mr. Peasley shot him. On his own admission his gun was dangerously loaded. Although a boy, a neighbor's son, was charged, through his act, with a serious offense against the laws, he made no confession, and when at last he did speak, it is at least open to debate whether he did it of his own volition or because he was forced to do so by the embarrassing question put to him by one of your number. I don't impugn his veracity, but I am bound to remark that he is an interested witness. All this is a question of fact for you to consider. I think you should know a little more. To determine if there was any motive, you need to know if there was any bad blood between Mr. Peasley and Lamoury. To find an indictment to fit the case, you need to know how badly Lamoury is hurt. I think you should have Lamoury here. Cross-questioning him, and perhaps Mr. Peasley," Solomon shivered, "should establish whether the shot was accidental, as the accused says, or intentional, as Lamoury contends. I'll have the complainant here tomorrow, if it's a possible thing. As there's no formal charge, as yet, against Mr. Peasley, I think you may properly postpone until then the question of entering a complaint or making an arrest, if necessary." Solomon shivered again. "And of his proper holding for appearance before the court. Meanwhile, I suggest that you dispose of the case against young Edwards and then adjourn. Mr. Peasley," he added significantly, "will of course be present tomorrow morning." "Sartain, sartain," answered poor Solomon tremulously. It was already late, and when the grand jury had formally dismissed the complaint against Jim, the hour was so advanced that adjournment was taken for the day.
When Mr. Peasley left the courthouse, no one spoke to him, and he walked slowly home, full of the worst forebodings. Why had he put in that marble? Relieved of his burden of anxiety and remorse in regard to Jim, he began to think more definitely than he had done heretofore of the possibility of serious harm to Lamoury. It was dreadful to think that he might have badly wounded an inoffensive man. Was Lamoury much hurt? What would happen to a marble in a shotgun, anyhow? Would he be arrested? Would his case get to trial? Could he, without a single witness, prove that it was an accident? The sinister figure of Jake Hibbard rose before him and made him feel helpless and frightened. The future looked black.
"But I done right," he tried to console himself by saying. "I done right."
Better late than never, to be sure, but if genuine comfort in a good deed is sought, it is best to act at once. Mr. Peasley could feel but small satisfaction in his tardy confession. Moreover, he must now face his wife. As he turned with reluctant feet into his own yard, he fairly shrank in anticipation under the sharp hail of her biting words. To postpone a little the inevitable, to gather strength somewhat to meet the shock, he passed the kitchen porch and went on toward the barn. Seating himself upon an upturned pail, he stayed there a long while, still as a statue, while he chewed the cud of bitter reflection. After a while, at the barn door there was a familiar flash of white and yellow. Looking wearily up, he saw the great green eyes of the calico cat fastened upon him in fierce distrust. She had one foot uplifted, as if she did not know whether it was safe to put it down, and in her mouth, pendant, was a calico kitten. Mr. Peasley, silent and immovable, watched her with apathetic eyes. Finally, as if assured he was not dangerous, she put down her foot and disappeared with soft and cushioned tread into the dim recesses of the barn. Yet a little while, and she again appeared in the doorway with a second duplicate of herself. Again an interval, and she brought a third.
"Well," said Solomon to himself, his spirit quite crushed, "I guess she ain't bringin' no more than belong to me by rights."
Nevertheless, he could not endure to see any others. He went desperately into the house, where he found his wife fuming over his delay.
"I guess I may as well tell you, first as last," he said in a sort of stubborn despair. "'Twas me that shot Lamoury."
"You?" exclaimed his wife, dropping her knife and fork, and looking at him as if she thought he had taken leave of his senses.
"I guess I'm the feller,"
he averred with queer, pathetic humor, and turning a patient, rounded back to his wife's expected indignation, he told his story while he nervously washed at the sink and fumblingly dried his face and hands in the coarse roller towel. He made these operations last as long as his confession. Then, at an end of his resources, he turned to face the storm. Mrs. Peasley simply looked at him. She struggled to speak, but she found herself in the predicament of one who has used up all ammunition on the skirmish line and comes helpless to the battle. She simply could think of nothing adequate to say. She stared at her husband while he stared out of the window. Then she gave it up. "Draw up your chair," she said sharply. "I guess you got to eat, whatever you be." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Calico Cat. When the grand jury dispersed after Mr. Peasley's confession, Farnsworth, first speaking a few words to Page, the state's attorney, hurried toward the Union School. As he expected, he met Miss Ware coming from it on her way to her boarding house. He waved his hat and called, "Jim's free!" As he reached her side, he added, "He didn't fire the shot at all." "Of course he didn't," said Nancy triumphantly. "Didn't I tell you? But who did? And how did you find out?"
"Peasley," said Farnsworth. "He owned up."
"Mr. Peasley? Then that awful harmonica, why, the wretch—"
"Shh!" warned Farnsworth. "Not so loud. These are jury room secrets which I'm not supposed to tell." But he told them nevertheless. As the two walked along together, he gave her an account of all that had happened. "But what I don't understand," he concluded, "is what made Jim behave so. What did he clean his gun for? Why did he hide the rags and put away the ammunition? He acted just as if he were trying to shield someone. We know he wasn't trying to shield himself, and I don't see why he should shield Peasley."
"Fred," said Nancy, stopping and facing him, "Jim knew that his father was the only person in the house, didn't he?"
"Yes," said Farnsworth.
"Then he thought his father did it."
"Oh, pshaw!" exclaimed Farnsworth. "He couldn't."
"Don't be rude, Fred," admonished Nancy. "Wasn't I right before? Well, I'm right now. How could he have thought anything else? I'm going straight to the jail and find out. And can we get him away from that jail?"
"Yes," said Farnsworth. "I spoke to Page. He said he'd bring the boy in and have him discharged this afternoon. He has to appear before the judge, you know, before he can be let go."
"That's nice," said Nancy. "Now, Fred, you go straight to Mr. Edwards and bring him up there, too. I don't suppose anyone's thought to tell him."
"But I haven't had any dinner," objected Farnsworth.
"Dinner!"
exclaimed Miss Ware in deep scorn, and Farnsworth laughed and surrendered. They separated then. Miss Ware took the side street to the jail, while Farnsworth hurried along toward Edwards' house. "Mr. Edwards," he said when that gentleman appeared at the door, "Miss Ware wants you right away at the jail." And as he spoke he was struck with the strain which showed in the man's face. He must have felt it a good deal, he reflected with surprise. A sudden fear showed in Mr. Edwards' eyes. "Jim isn't sick, is he?" he asked. "Oh, no," replied Farnsworth hastily. "He's cleared, that's all. We'll have him out of jail this afternoon." "Cleared?" repeated Mr. Edward distrustfully. Was Farnsworth joking? Nothing was more certain in the father's mind than that Jim had fired the shot. No other supposition was possible. His face grew severe at the thought that Farnsworth was trifling with him. "Yes, cleared," said the young man, somewhat nettled. "We have absolute certain proof that Jim hadn't anything to do with it." "I should like to hear it," said Mr. Edwards coldly. "Well, we have the real offender's own confession," said Farnsworth, irritated at the incredulity of the man. What was the fellow made of? Mr. Edwards said nothing. He turned and got his hat, and walked with Farnsworth up the street the half-mile to the jail. His face was impassive, but his movements had a new alertness, and Farnsworth noted that he had to walk painfully fast to keep up with this much older man. Edwards, in spite of his cold exterior, was a man of strong feeling, and there was, in fact, a deep joy and a deep regret at his heart. He knew with thankfulness that he had a truthful and courageous son. He saw with passionate self-reproach that he had done the boy a great injustice. But why? Why had Jim cleaned the gun? Farnsworth, little guessing the turmoil in the heart of the grave man by his side, was wondering if, after all, Miss Ware could be right in thinking that Jim had sacrificed himself for this unfeeling parent. If she is right, he reflected, thinking how harsh had been the father's treatment of the boy, what a little brick Jim is! He had a very human desire to present this view and prick this automaton into some show of life. "Mr. Edwards," he said suddenly, "Jim knew, didn't he, that you were the only person besides himself at home?" "I suppose so." "Does it occur to you that he may have thought you did the shooting?" "That can't be so," said Mr. Edwards, but there was a note of shocked concern, of dismay in his tone which satisfied Farnsworth, and again he thought more kindly of his companion. And Mr. Edwards was stirred by the unexpected question. After all, he thought, since Jim was not trying to shield himself, whom else could he wish to shield? And a sudden deep enthusiasm filled him for this son who was not only courageous and truthful, but who, in spite of his unjust treatment, was loyal, who, he thrilled at the word, loved him. But no, it was not possible. How could his son have thought that he could accuse his boy of what he had done himself? And upon this doubt, he found himself with a quickened pulse at the door of the jail. Farnsworth rang the bell. Soon they stood in Mrs. Calkins's sitting room, facing Jim and Nancy. And then Miss Ware caught Farnsworth by the arm and drew him quickly into the hall and shut the door behind her. "I'm certain," she whispered breathlessly, "when I told Jim first, he wasn't glad at all, until I managed to let him know his father wasn't arrested. Oh, Fred, that boy's a little trump." Meanwhile, in Mrs. Calkins's sitting room, father and son faced each other, and it would be hard to say which of the two was the more embarrassed. But certain questions burned on Mr. Edwards' lips. "Jim," he said with anxious emotion, "did you think that I shot Lamoury?" "Yes, sir," said Jim. "But why, my boy? Why should I want to shoot him?" "Lamoury had been telling," said Jim, highly embarrassed. "Telling?" said his father in perplexity. "Yes, sir," said Jim. You know, about your being a smuggler?" Much astonished, Mr. Edwards pushed his questions, and soon came to know the depth and breadth of his boy's misconception. "Then," he said finally, "when I accused you of having fired the shot, you thought I had to do so to avoid an arrest which would be serious for me. Is that it?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Edwards could not speak for a moment for emotion. Then he drew the boy to him. My son," he said, "you and I must know each other better." And by the same token, Jim realized that his father was proud of him and loved him. It was new and sweet. He felt a little foolish, but very happy. "Jim," his father said huskily, "would you like a new breech loader?" And then Jim was happier still. Those were reluctant feet which dragged Mr. Peasley the next morning to the jury room. The counsel of the night had brought no comfort, and when he came among his fellows their constraint and silence were far from reassuring. Nor when the sitting had begun did he like the enigmatic smile with which the well-dressed page stood and swung his watch-chain. How he distrusted and feared this smug, self-complacent young man! Yet the state's attorney's first words brought him unexpected comfort. "Mr. Lamoury," he said, still with that puzzling smile, "has consented, in spite of his serious physical condition, to appear before you." Lamoury could not be so badly hurt if he could come to the courthouse, but what was this? While the state's attorney held wide the door, Jake Hibbard solemnly pushed into the room a great wheeled chair, in which sat the small, wiry, furtive-eyed Lamoury. Mr. Peasley's heart sank as he saw the wheeled chair, and noted the great bandages about the Frenchman's head and arm. He listened apprehensively to the loud complaint of cruelty to his client which Hibbard continued to make, until Page, pulling the chair into the room, blandly shut the door in his face. Mr. Peasley heaved a great sigh of mingled contrition and fear. This wreck was his work. He would be punished for it. "Mr. Lamoury," Page began courteously, "we so wish to get your version of this painful affair that, though we are sorry to cause you any discomfort, we have felt obliged to bring you here. Will you kindly tell the gentlemen of the grand jury what happened?" "Yes, sir, I told him," said Lamoury eagerly. Confident that no one knew anything about what had happened, except Jim Edwards and himself, he intended to make his narrative striking. "Yes, sir, I told the truth. Well, sir, I'll be going through Monsieur Edwards' orchard, walking through same as any man's. Then I look, and I see dat leetly boy in the window, a-shouting and a-cussing like he gone crazy in his head. I tell you I feel bad for how dat leetly boy cussing. Dat was too shame." And Lamoury paused to let this beautiful sentiment impress itself upon the jurors. Mr. Peasley listened with profound astonishment. "Then he hollers something I can't hear, only Canuck, and I begins to get my mads up. I hain't do him no harm, hain? Then he fires his gun, poom, and mortars 20, probably 10 buckshot, hit me on the head of it."
"Buckshot? Them's the marble," thought Mr. Peasley, "but there wasn't but one."
"I told you they strong like... I told you they sting like bumblebees. I think me, that wicked little boy going for shoot more as once probably, maybe 2, 3 time. I drop quick in the grass, and I run quick, and when I get home I find 2, 3, 5, maybe 4 hole in my arm, more big as my thumb."
Pete stopped dramatically. His little sparkling black eyes traveled quickly from one face to another to note the effect he had made. Mr. Peasley's spirits were rising. The grand jury could not believe such a passel of lies. Only was one of those holes big as my thumb, made perchance by a marble?
"That's a mighty moving narrative," commented Sampson dryly. Did I understand you to say that you were hit in the head or the arm?" "Both of it," averred Pete without winking.
"I didn't shoot at a bag of marbles," whispered Mr. Peasley to his neighbor, who nodded. That he had the courage to address a remark to anyone shows how his spirits were rising. "You said you were going along the short-cut through Mr. Edwards' orchard, didn't you?" the state's attorney now asked.
Yes, sir, said Pete. Page stepped to a big blackboard, which he had set up at the end of the room, and rapidly sketched a plan of the Edwards lot, with the aid of a memorandum of measurements which he had secured. A line across the upper left-hand corner represented the path commonly used by the neighbors in going through the Edwards orchard. "Now, Mr. Lamoury," resumed Page, "I don't quite understand how, if you were on the path there, you could have seen young Edwards, or he you. The barn seems to be in the way until just at the right-hand end, and when you get to that, you'd have to look through about 10 rows of apple trees. Now, weren't you a little off the line?" "Damn!" exclaimed Pete ingenuously. "I was got for be, since I was shoot, ain't I? I can't remember." "Mr. Edwards told us," continued Page, while Solomon's heart warmed to him, "that he saw you fall out of some bushes. Now these are the only bushes there are," and he rapidly indicated on the board the rows of currant bushes, the asparagus, the sunflowers, and the lilacs which lined the garden on its right-hand corner. "That's a good way from the path." "I'll be there, me!" cried Pete in indignant alarm. "No, sir. Monsieur Edwards say dat. Respectable mans like Monsieur Edwards. It was shame for lie so. No, sir. I go home to the orchard. Maybe I go a little way off the path of it, maybe for pick up apple off of the ground, what no one hain't want for rot of it. I don't remember. But I hain't go for hide in the bush. I'll be honest mans, me. I'll go for walk where all mans can see, hain't it? What I'll go hide for, me?" Page drew a square on Mr. Peasley's side of the fence, directly opposite the bushes. "That," said he, "is Mr. Peasley's hen-house," and he brushed the chalk from his fingers with an air of indifference. "So?" cried Pete, with an air of pleased surprise. "Monsieur Peasley, he got hen-house? First time I was heard of it, me. Fine ting for him hen-house, fine ting for Monsieur Peasley. I'll tink him for be lucky, Monsieur Peasley. But I ain't know it. I ain't seen nossing of it, no sir." And Pete smiled innocently round at the enigmatic faces of the jurymen. "Mr. Lamoury," said Page with a very casual air, "behind those bushes is a broken board." "So?" said Pete. Anyone who was there had an excellent chance to study the fastenings of Mr. Peasley's hen-house door. "May, I was told you I'll not be there, me!" cried Pete, alarmed and excited. "That," said Mr. Page calmly, "is the only place where you could be and get shot from the boy's window. Either you were there or you weren't shot. Besides, Mr. Edwards found your footprints." Pete shrunk his head into his shoulders and glared questioningly at the state's attorney. The examination was not going to his liking. "What I'll care for dat?" he said at last. "Oh, nothing," said Page. "Nothing at all. Let us talk of something else. Let me ask why Mr. Edwards discharged you from his employ last spring?" "Nossing, nossing. I'll be work for him more good as never was." "If he treated you as unjustly as that," said Page with sympathy, "you cannot have a very high opinion of Mr. Edwards." "I told you he was bad mans. He discharged me more as 60 miles off. I'll have for walk, me. I'll told you dat was mean trick for play on poor mans." And Pete sought sympathy from the faces about him. "That was too bad, certainly," said Page. "Now about those wounds of yours.
I have Dr. Brigham here, ready to make an examination. I'll call him now." And the state's attorney started toward the door of the witness room. Pete jumped. "Hein!" he exclaimed. "You don't object to having an excellent doctor like Dr. Brigham look at your wounds, do you?" asked Page. Now Lamoury had no wounds to show. The smiling, well-dressed Page, standing there and looking at him with amused comprehension, was more than he could bear. Pete suddenly lost his temper, never too secure. Out of his wheeled chair he jumped, and shaking his fist in Page's face, he shouted, "Tink you be smart, very smart mans. Well, I tole you you hain't. I tole you you be a great big pig. I tole you that Edwards boy, he shoot at me. I see him. 'Tain't my fault of it if he not hit me, hein? You be pig. You be all pigs, every one." And Pete, making a wide, inclusive gesture, shouted, "I care not more as 1 cent for the whole kit and caboodle of it. Pig, pig, pig." And turning on his heel, the wrathful Frenchman left the room. He left also a convulsed jury and a wheeled chair, for the hire of which Hibbard found himself later obliged to pay. Mr. Peasley, the thermometer of whose spirits had been rising steadily, joined in the laughter which followed the exit of the discomfited Pete.
"Terrible smart fella, Page, ain't he?" said he to Albion Small. "Did him up real slick, didn't he?" The delighted Solomon had quite forgotten his dislike for the citified Page. Of course the grand jury promptly abandoned the inquiry. The fact was now obvious that the vengeful Lamoury, aided by the unscrupulous Hibbard, had merely hoped to be bought off by Mr. Edwards, and had been disappointed. "The case," said Page, "would never have come to trial. If Edwards had persisted and let his boy go to court, they'd have had to stop. They must have been a good deal disappointed when he refused bail. They probably thought he'd never let the boy pass a night in Hotel Calkins." Mr. Peasley walked home sobered but relieved. The loss of public esteem which had come to him through his foolish adventure, the serious wrong which he had inflicted upon Jim Edwards, the disgust of his wife were all things to chasten a man's spirit. But on the other hand, Jim was now out of jail, Lamoury had not been hurt in the least, and he himself had not been complained of or arrested. If he should have to endure some chaffing from Jim Bartlett and Cy Spooner, his cronies at the bank, he guessed he could stand it. On the whole, he was moderately happy. The sun was low in the west, and the trees were casting long shadows across his yard, brightly spattered with the red and yellow of autumnal leaves. His house, white and neat and comfortable, seemed basking like some still, somnolent animal in the warm sunshine. Solomon turned and cast his eye down the road and over the random river, flowing smooth and peaceful through its great oxbow. He recognized Danny Snow, scuffling through the dust with his bare feet, as he drove home his father's great, placid, full-uddered cow. The comfort of the scene, the cozy pleasantness of the place among the close-coming hills, struck him in his relieved mood as it had never done before. Even though disappointed in political ambition, a man might live there in some content. After all, he had $30,000, and it had been calmly drawing interest through all his tribulations. Consoled by this reflection, he walked to the rear of his house and began pottering about the chicken yard. Then in the Edwards garden appeared Jim. Solomon gave a slight start, and took a hesitating step or two, as if minded to flee, but restrained by shame. He watched the boy come to the fence and climb upon it. He said nothing.
He could not think of anything to say.
"That harmonica was fine," said Jim, grinning amiably.
Mr. Peasley was immensely relieved. If there was a momentary twinge at the thought of the money it had cost him, it was quickly gone.
"Glad you enjoyed it. Seems though I wanted to give you a little something, considerin'. I hope you and your father ain't ones to lay it up agin me."
"That's all right," said Jim grandly. "I had a bully time at the jail. Mrs. Calkins is a splendid woman. You just ought to eat one of her doughnuts."
"Didn't know they fed you up much to the jail," commented Solomon, puzzled.
"Oh, I wasn't locked up," said Jim, and explained.
"Well, well, I'm beat. That was clever on 'em, wasn't it now?"
said Mr. Peasley, much pleased.
"And father ain't holding any grudge either," said Jim. "He says he's much obliged to you,"
a remark which the reader will understand better than Mr. Peasley ever did.
"You listen when you're eating your supper,"
cried Jim as he climbed down from the fence and ran toward the house.
"I'm going to play on that harmonica."
And Solomon rejoiced. Poor man, he did not know how the popularity of his gift was destined to endure. He did not know that he had let loose upon the circumambient air sounds worse than any ever emitted by the Calico Cat. Filled with the pleasant sense of having made it up with the boy whom he thought he had so greatly injured, Solomon started along the path toward the kitchen door. He began to realize that he had an appetite, something now long unfamiliar to him. As he drew near, an appetizing odor smote his nostrils.
"Oysters, I swanny!"
he ejaculated. It was unheard of. There was nothing which Solomon, who had a keen relish for good things to eat, and would even have been extravagant in this one particular had his firm-willed wife permitted, enjoyed more than an oyster stew, or which he had a chance to taste less often. Oysters could be had in town for 60 cents a quart, a sum that seems not large, but in Mrs. Peasley's mind they were associated with the elegance and luxury of church sociables, and with the dissipation of supper after country dances. They were extravagant food. Solomon could not believe his nose. He entered the door, and there upon the table stood the big tureen, with 2 soup plates at Mrs. Peasley's place. There was nothing else but the stew, of course, but it lent a gala air to the whole kitchen.
"Why, Sarepty,"
he said to his wife.
"You going to be arrested?"
asked Mrs. Peasley sharply. She wanted no sentiment over her unwonted generosity, but, truth to tell, when she had seen Solomon depart that morning, and realized that he might be going to arrest, possibly to trial, perhaps to conviction and to jail, she had felt a sudden fright, a sudden sympathy for her husband, and she had bought half a pint of oysters for a stew, in spite of expense.
"No, I ain't going to be arrested," said Solomon with satisfaction. "The grand jury found there wasn't anything to it, but Sarepty—"
He paused helplessly, unable to express his complex feelings about the stew and the attitude on the part of his wife which it revealed.
"Oh, well," said his wife, "after all, 'tain't as if you'd gone and lost money."
And after supper Mr. Peasley carefully poured some skimmed milk into a saucer and went out to the barn.
"Kitty, Kitty,"
he called.
"Kitty, come, Kitty."
The Calico Cat did not respond, but in the morning the saucer was empty. That is the end of chapter